depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and we're going to get started in just a couple minutes. So please hold tight. We're giving everyone time to log in from the waiting room and get connected, and we'll start momentarily. So for all who are joining, thank you for coming today. We're going to give people a minute or two to get connected before we officially begin the substantive discussion on today's webinar. So please hold tight in the audience. I see people are still trickling in from the waiting room. We'll get started very momentarily, and I'll turn things over to Bill Weiss shortly. All right, so I think we're starting to see a slowdown in the new attendees joining from the waiting room. So I think we're ready to get started. So thank you all for joining today's session. I know we've got a lot of people calling in early from the United States and late from Southeast Asia. So we look forward to a really substantive conversation today. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and I'm going to be helping run things behind the scenes and then jumping back in for the Q&A. So throughout today's conversation, if any of you in the audience have comments or questions, we really hope that you'll share them with us through the Q&A function. And when we get to sort of the open discussion at the end, I'll help Bill moderate and pull questions from that. So if at any time you have questions, please do throw them in there and we'll get to them later on in today's session. So with that note, Bill, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you to get the discussion going. I'll be here in the background, and I look forward to learning from Amitav and Alice and Kavi and today's conversation.
Thank you, Courtney, and good morning to everyone on the U.S. East Coast who's joining us, and good evening to our audience in Southeast Asia. Welcome to the first Southeast Asia Forum seminar for the fall 2021 semester. We're glad to have you with us for this event and hope you'll continue to participate in our twice monthly seminars on key issues for Southeast Asia and U.S. Southeast Asia relations. We also welcome today our Southeast Asia Forum partners, the Southeast Asia League of Students at Johns Hopkins SAIS, the U.S. Indonesia Society, and the U.S. Philippines Society. This Southeast Asia Forum is a project of the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center. Our mission is to promote the study of Southeast Asia and U.S. Southeast Asia relations at colleges, universities, and research institutions in the U.S. Mid-Atlantic region and beyond. We are hosted by the Stimson Center, but we're entirely self-supporting. So we're very grateful to our friend Henry Howard, member of our advisory council, for his help in kicking off the fall 2021 programs. We're also grateful to two anonymous donors for supporting these seminars as well. You can assist our work by donating at the Southeast Asia Forum web pages on the Stimson website. This is our first seminar in academic year 2021-22, as I mentioned. Once again, this fall we are conducting our seminars via Zoom. We hope that the pandemic will be under control soon, allowing us to meet in person in the Stimson Center in the spring. We also said that last year, and here we are again today. This fall, we'll be offering a mix of public and private seminars on a semi-monthly basis. Our next public seminar will be on October 22nd. Details will be posted on the Southeast Asia Forum web pages found on the Stimson Center website. And as a reminder to all, this seminar is being recorded and will be available on those very web pages. Well, we have a great seminar for you today, but before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize the passing of Fred Brown, longtime Southeast Asia specialist, diplomat, educator, and friend of the Southeast Asia Forum. When we established the forum 20 months ago, we named the Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia Roundtable after Fred, and in recognition of his many contributions to Southeast Asia studies. We're proud to remember him today. Our topic for this seminar is ASEAN and the return of geopolitics to the Indo-Pacific. You may wonder when geopolitics left the Indo-Pacific, and we'll get into that question in our discussion. In the process, we'll also be talking about US-China competition in Southeast Asia, the Biden administration's strategy for the Indo-Pacific, what ASEAN centrality means in contemporary Southeast Asia, the problem Myanmar poses for ASEAN, and the continuing trauma of COVID-19 in the region, and whatever else is on the minds of our three highly regarded experts, as well as our audience. So let me introduce our experts briefly. They are, in fact, three very well-known Southeast Asia specialists. Amitav Acharya is the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at the School of International Service, American University in Washington. He is also chair of the ASEAN Studies Initiative at American University. At this point, I need to point out that the ASEAN Studies Initiative is co-sponsoring this event. Amitav has just published a new book on Southeast Asia entitled ASEAN and Regional Order, Revisiting Security Community in Southeast Asia. We'll be talking about the ideas in his book during our seminar today. Alice Baugh is professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. Her research focuses on the international relations of Southeast Asia with a special attention to ASEAN, regional cooperative regimes, and Southeast Asia major power relations, especially with China and the United States. She's the author of Renegotiating East and Southeast Asia, Regionalism, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and is a research associate of our co-sponsor, the ASEAN Studies Center. She's also a member of the Southeast Asia Forum Advisory Council. Kavi Chongkitavorn is Senior Fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. He is a veteran Thai journalist and commentator on Southeast Asia affairs. He spent more than 3 decades with a Bangkok-based English newspaper, The Nation, and his opinion column now appears regularly in the Bangkok Post. I've asked Professor Acharya to describe briefly his book. Then Professor Baugh and Kavi will offer some comments on these general topics that I've mentioned above. We'll talk for a few minutes among the four of us and then address questions that you in our audience may have. And Courtney will organize the question and answer session. So Amitav, please begin.
Thank you, Bill Wise. Thank you for hosting and organizing, Bill Wise and Courtney, of course, Stimson Center for organizing this. And I'm particularly pleased to see my old friends, Alice Baugh, of course, Kavi Chongkitavorn. When I started my research on ASEAN in 1987, one of the first people I talked to was Kavi Chongkitavorn, who was, I think, deputy editor at The Nation those days in Bangkok. And over the years, we have stayed in touch and very regularly interacted a few times a year, except for the last year. So very happy to see you. Thank you also, Bill, for mentioning the ASEAN Studies Initiative, because we were created in 2010 with the blessing of the late Surin Pitchwan, the former Secretary General of ASEAN and Thai Foreign Minister, as the first really research and training center in the United States devoted exclusively to ASEAN. So this is more of an ASEAN center rather than a Southeast Asia center. We focus on the institutional dimension of ASEAN. So my colleague, Dr. Heng Pek Kun, I don't know the seats here, but everybody's busy teaching these days. But her leadership and vision has been really central to the ASEAN Studies Initiative. And we partner regularly, think tanks like Stimson, and I'm very happy to be. This will be my first appearance before your Southeast Asia program at Stimson. Now, I will be showing you just one slide, just as a way of focusing your attention and my attention as well. That will basically summarize that part of my book that deals with geopolitics. So just indulge me for a second. Okay. Okay, so this book that you see in 2021 is basically the latest iteration of a book that started 20 years ago when I was much younger, not a single hair, and my head was gray, and I wasn't even wearing glasses. So this was actually a high point of ASEAN because ASEAN has, ASEAN was considered much more successful then, although despite the 1997 economic crisis, Asian financial crisis, ASEAN was riding much higher those days. And then we had two editions after that, 2009 and 2014. And now, of course, this book is now considered, or not considered, as in Google Scholar citation, the most widely cited book on Asian security or Asia-Pacific security, not just Southeast Asia, but Asia-Pacific security, according to a recent survey. So by far the most cited globally book on Asian security. So it has been extremely successful in a way that I did not anticipate. But it also tells you that ASEAN is very important. ASEAN is a major theme in Asian security. And again, I'm talking about Google Scholar citations. I'm talking about maybe a more academic look at it. But the fact that a book on Southeast Asia, rather than China, rather than Japan, rather than US, Asia Pacific, is the most cited book in Google Scholar on Asian security tells you that ASEAN matters in the intellectual domain, and I think also the public policy domain around the world. Now, the 2021 book basically covers the period from 2014 to 2020. But I did manage to put a little bit stuff on Myanmar because in that book I had predicted there will be a coup in Myanmar when the book was submitted in October 2020. And when that happened in February 2021, all I needed to do is to ask the publisher if I can insert just one line or half a line that as happened in February 2021. So I'm very pleased with the way the book's assumptions and research that's played out. And it's not just in the case of the coup in Myanmar, but also in terms of how I had anticipated the geopolitics of the region. Now, so the slide I would like to show is this one. So the theme of today is a return of geopolitics. And as Bill Weiss pointed out very correctly, that since when Southeast Asia left geopolitics. However, there is a difference between old and new geopolitics, and we have to keep that in mind. And that will be my framing. Now, many of you know about ASEAN. You know that ASEAN was a child of geopolitics. Without geopolitics, there will be no Southeast Asia, no ASEAN. The name Southeast Asia comes or popularized mainly because of the wartime Southeast Asia command of the Allied powers under Lord Louis Mountbatten. So that did more than anything else to popularize the term, at least in the international imagination. Then we had, of course, ASEAN got its kind of a bit of a boost in a very ironical way after the US withdrawal from Vietnam, and everybody was talking about how this might impact the region, how this will be a blow to the United States, there'll be more instability, Vietnam will try to export its revolution. But ASEAN actually did very well out of that. The ASEAN actually got strengthened by the last kind of old geopolitics of the Cold War. And that's another story, but I just want to remind you what the late Lee Kuan Yew, the leader of Singapore, used to say, that it was the US military presence and sort of economic engagement in the region that contributed to the stability and prosperity of Southeast Asia. Now, I don't entirely agree with that, but what it reminds you that ASEAN actually has done quite well out of geopolitics, the old geopolitics. Now, will it do so in the new geopolitics? The new geopolitics is very different in a kind of a, probably this way. The distribution of power has changed. Economic and military balance is now more towards China. Economic interdependence is more denser now than 60 years ago, but it is tilting more towards China than towards the West. Institutional density is much higher. There are more institutions in the region, both Southeast Asia, but East Asia and Asia Pacific. but the institutions are not performing, especially in the last 10 years or so. And ideology is weaker. That may be the best news, because there is really no ideological rivalry in the region. And despite what people say about China exporting its model, I don't think it is anywhere close to the ideological rivalry of the Cold War period. But the new geopolitics has good and bad elements, especially depends on who you are. From the United States, of course, it is much more challenging. But for Southeast Asia also, it is challenging in the sense that while Southeast Asia and ASEAN benefited from the old geopolitics, they may not be able to do so in the new geopolitics unless they get their acts together. Now, in my book, I found generally that in terms of, let's say, focusing on geopolitics in 5 areas, but very quickly, and I put them as questions because this is social science, so no answer is definitive. So while the US-China rivalry is seen as a zero-sum game in Washington or Western capitals, it is not seen in the same way in the region. It is seen as much more complex rather than zero-sum. But if China wins, America loses, and vice versa. Also, in the past year, especially since COVID, but going back to past 5 years or so, China's trust deficit has declined. This is very visible in opinion surveys, but also interviews that one could do. I did a bunch of them by Zoom last year. China's trust deficit is nowhere what it used to be. China's trust, China's so-called soft power is nowhere what it used to be in the early 2000s. Remember those days people used to talk about the charm offensive. Well, now people talk about wolf warrior diplomacy. So China has, despite its growing power, but maybe because of its growing power, has lost a fair amount of trust in the region. But does that mean it's an opportunity for the US? Well, one might think so, that if the United States plays its cards well, and with the transition from Trump to Biden, there has been a little bit of hope that the United States can come back in the region in terms of its trust and soft power. But again, this is a question mark for me. And I do see signs of United States doing much better in terms of trust and perception, at least before Afghanistan withdrawal, but it's not definitive. But this is something we should keep watching. Keep a watch on. Third is ASEAN bandwagoning. Some people have argued, I believe my friend David Schrambaugh has argued that ASEAN might have moved beyond hedging to bandwagoning towards China. I don't see it that way. I think ASEAN is continuing to co-engage both the powers. Again, doesn't see the rivalry in zero-sum terms, at least in general, ASEAN doesn't see it as a zero-sum game. So it is still very much interested in co-engaging both US and China and other powers, rather than bandwagon with one against the other. Then ASEAN centrality is definitely eroding. It has really lost, partly because of internal disunity, but also because of the escalating rivalry between US and China. But there is really no alternative platform to ASEAN. If you want to have an institution in the mix of factors, drivers of stability, there is really no other institution that can replace ASEAN. So this is to ASEAN's advantage, but it may be also a matter of how well ASEAN can handle this responsibility. So, but at least ASEAN does have that thing going for it. And finally, Indo-Pacific, I see it as a work in progress. Different ideas and approaches to Indo-Pacific, what it means, how to go about it, who leads, and there are substantial differences within ASEAN, between some ASEAN members and the US, even among the so-called Quad members. And now this has been made more complicated by the AUKUS, the Submarine Intelligence and Military Technology Cooperation Agreement between United States, Australia, and UK. So the Indo-Pacific is kind of a very complex now, different layers of it. So we have to also wait and see how this affects the Quad, because the United States has different type of special relationships, and they complement or conflict with each other. But I would like to then come back to the old geopolitics and new geopolitics and end. I think ASEAN I'm not giving any policy advice to Americans or Chinese, but if I could say something about ASEAN, the way ASEAN can ride over this, and this is discussed in the conclusion of my book, downsize its mission. ASEAN has taken too many meetings, too much. You should focus mostly on what's happening in Southeast Asia rather than the Asia-wider geopolitics, where it has no control over. Resolve the crisis, the tragic political situation in Myanmar, Burma, and continue its co-engagement policy. That policy serves ASEAN very well, rather than taking sides. And I think that should continue, even strengthen, and develop a much more coherent Indo-Pacific approach, because ASEAN has this ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, but it's not a very specific, solid document. It's a very general document. And ASEAN's approach to Indo-Pacific varies from country to country, member to member, and it's which is very fluid, by the way. And developing because that's going to be the reality. So let me conclude by saying that the last time the United States withdrew from a major conflict, it actually got stronger. The US withdrawal from Vietnam actually helped Southeast Asia and also helped to create more focus on the military presence in the maritime spaces of Indo-Pacific. So we might disagree with that, but I think the United States generally did well out of withdrawing from Vietnam. Now everybody is jumping on the Biden administration for the way it handled Afghanistan, and some of the criticism is justified. But actually, to me, it seems that there is a certain amount of consistency in US policy. This withdrawal process started with Trump, pursued by Biden, and it may actually come out to be a good thing for the United States. And despite some sort of a perceptual loss of perception of US credibility, it might actually turn out to be good for the United States. And certainly Afghanistan is not just a US problem anymore, it's the world's problem, China's problem, Pakistan's problem. And also it might actually help the stability of the region if the United States can actually focus in the Indo-Pacific. Maybe I have some differences with the way the US is pursuing that policy, but I will be counterintuitive and say that the Afghanistan withdrawal, despite the short-term pains, might actually benefit the United States and may even benefit ASEAN in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amitav. That is a very broad and wide-ranging set of issues that you've raised. I think you've given us quite a bit to discuss, and let me turn now to Professor Alice Baugh and ask your thoughts on these important subjects.
So first, I want to say thank you, Bill, and thank you to the Stimson Center and Southeast Asia Forum for including me on this important discussion. I'm very happy to always join both Amitav and Kavi, who are, I think, two of the most astute observers of ASEAN, all things ASEAN. So thank you very much for including me. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively short. Amitav's book offers a very useful update, so buy it. And of course, in his comments, he's hit on what I think most would agree are ASEAN's most important challenges at this point in time. Certainly covers it better than I can. So what I'm going to do is maybe kind of enter into some of those points in a somewhat different way, and just simply start by saying that there's an argument to be made that the space within which ASEAN has to maneuver has been closing at key levels, right? Global, regional, as well as domestic. Amitav has already mentioned great power competition, and I think great power competition certainly has a way of constraining space. Though I would also argue it creates opportunities, which I think Southeast Asian states have also taken advantage of. But yes, it can constrain space, especially at times of intensified rivalry as we are seeing now. I think, some have said that one reason that ASEAN was able to play the role that it did in earlier times, the 90s, early 2000s, the height of ASEAN, as Amitav put it, is that at those times, the large powers cared more about ASEAN than they do today, right? This is what's being said. And I might push back against this narrative a little bit, because I think even early on, ASEAN had some challenges convincing large powers about the merits of ASEAN multilateralism and ASEAN platforms. And so I think in that sense, there's an ongoing consistent challenge and discourse about ASEAN platforms in relation to the larger powers. I think on the other two levels, regionally and domestically, we are also seeing sharpened divides between ASEAN states for both geopolitical and domestic reasons. These are not perfect fault lines. I think we can certainly cite some of them, but they're not perfect fault lines. But I think these differences are affecting how ASEAN works. These conditions, I think, have created, as Amitav has suggested, a lot of hand-wringing, right? A lot of hand-wringing about ASEAN centrality. And I think we should acknowledge the importance of ASEAN centrality as a strategic principle, because that's what it is, right? It's a strategic principle. It's a powerful organizing idea. But I think it might be worth reframing what that challenge is about, right? And what ASEAN is also best able to do. And what ASEAN does best, I would argue, is connect actors more intensively and connect actors that might not connect otherwise, right? ASEAN states can't do a lot to change US-China dynamics. That's between them. And I think we all agree that they have a whole range of problems that they're going to have to deal with, right? But what ASEAN can do is make that polarization a little less brittle for Southeast Asia. And one way I think that they've done that, both ASEAN and individual ASEAN states have done that, is to assure and regularize some of those ongoing connections between themselves and external powers. And that is through things like economic integration, right? Economic partnerships, economic connectivity, diplomatic communication, opportunities for different kinds of cooperation and in different forms. It need not all be within ASEAN or ASEAN frameworks, but I think ASEAN has facilitated different forms of cooperation and connections with different partners. I think it's also worth noting here how this serves what I would argue, and I think many would agree, are ASEAN and ASEAN states' most important priorities. And ASEAN's most important priority is not ASEAN centrality per se, right? Though again, we should acknowledge that it is important. So what are ASEAN's priorities? It's connections within ASEAN, right? It's connectivity within ASEAN, between ASEAN and others. ASEAN's most important priority overall, maintaining relations amongst themselves. ASEAN's most important priority vis-a-vis the United States and China is to maintain favorable relations with external powers, both external powers, China and the United States, as well as others. And so we should avoid thinking about ASEAN priorities as centrality in the literal sense of the word, but instead in terms of connectivity. And so the measure of ASEAN's efforts should not be the US-China relationship or again, how truly central it is, but rather the extent to which those connections it facilitates can assure favorable relations between Southeast Asian states and also between Southeast Asian states on the one hand and the US and China on the other. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor to Kavi.
Great. Kavi?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Bill for invitations to join the two world-leading ASEAN guru. It's very difficult to discuss ASEAN about after Amitav and Alice. I will pick up on certain issues. I just want to say that at the moment, ASEAN is worried about its economics recovery ability during the pandemic and in the next few months, because this is what they are obsessed, because we have problems with vaccinations and also all these countering measures which have not yet worked well, as you can see. ASEAN at the moment is facing internal crisis. Each country has its own measure. They try to organize a common approach. I'm very glad to tell you that ASEAN has agreed to spend half of the so-called ASEAN COVID-19 Response Fund, about 10 million to buy vaccine from COVAX under the WHO. I think this is a very good and very first step that ASEAN taken together, and this show that ASEAN can do things together. The so-called ASEAN centrality is strong, and I think is still well. And talking about the COVID a little bit, this is where US and China will make a difference. If somebody asks me what would happen from now on between the role of the US and the China, I think it will be heightened through the so-called vaccine diplomacy. And I think after April, Biden realized that if you want to engage Asia, you have to win the heart of Asia, which is Southeast Asia. And this is the best time to do it, is to go straight to the public health issue, donate vaccine. So I was very happy to hear that United States is donating vaccine, even though it's a small number comparison to the Chinese, because the Chinese was the first country to declare that vaccine should be the so-called common public good. So China went ahead and did much better. But of course, given the qualities of the vaccine, some prefer the Americans. But as you know, China has a much broader recipients in the region. So during the pandemic, even China, as the Amitav has pointed out correctly, that there is trust deficit. I think China is facing difficulty in engaging with ASEAN, not to mention the negotiation over South China Sea. You also have the area now, which could be the new competitive area, that is the Mekong sub-region. But given the urgency of the matter dealing with the pandemic, you can see that all ASEAN countries have welcomed Chinese vaccine, even though there were some reports of the qualities and the efficacy. But I don't think that's matter anymore, because people in Southeast Asia now will want to have enough vaccine. And with that kind of proximity and continuity, China has continuity policy toward ASEAN. The leader never meets ASEAN summit, not like the United States. And I don't understand why Biden have been in power for 7 and 8 months, have not yet made any commitments to attend the ASEAN related summit. It will come out in the next 7 weeks. My goodness, you know. So this is something to show that America is really paid attention to ASEAN. Secondly, ASEAN now is putting in a very great difficulty. As Amitav said, and also Alice said, ASEAN would not choose side. Even though sometimes ASEAN show much more favorite attitude towards America, but they will not say so. But this is a big issue. And I think the word that Amitav used, co-engaging, is a good one. Of course, people in this region will use the words coexist, because we have been living with China for thousands of years. And we together actually have a different view and policies toward China. I must repeat, we do not share American views of China at all. This is why it's a waste of time for America to lecture Southeast Asia about China rising power, what China going to do if you're not on our side, or blah, 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 blah. So there's no need, because we know exactly what to do. And finally, I think ASEAN need to re-examine its role in the much broader Indo-Pacific. I think we have ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific. I think it's a good start. It's a framework, mind you, and it's not yet the finale. And I think a lot more would come. And it's unfortunate that last year, ASEAN could not join together to operationalize. And I think I would like to mention this, that Japan is very clever to associate Japan with AOIP. The United States has not. United States is actually challenging AOIP. So I think ASEAN need to use AOIP as the framework, as the mechanism to link all the rest to come in, because there are a lot of contesting framework to make sure that we serve as a bridge. I will end here. Bill?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your, as always, incisive observations. And thank you, Professor Ba, as well. Before we get to our questions, I want to return for a moment to the question of the return of geopolitics to the Indo-Pacific region and to Southeast Asia in particular. You all have emphasized the ASEAN's goal of co-engagement with China and the US, not choosing sides in the competition between the two countries and so forth. And you've also mentioned ASEAN's role as a convener, bringing major powers together in a communicative mode rather than a conflictive one. And President Biden, in his address at the UN yesterday, held out perhaps something less than an olive branch, but the possibility that cooperation on important issues would be the most important theme in American approach, especially to the world, but especially to Asia. And in this circumstance, ASEAN's circumstance works beautifully. This fits exactly a place where ASEAN would like to be. But U.S. has also taken some steps in the last several years that suggest a more important insurance policy being taken out in case the relationship with China, in fact, deteriorates. I hate to use the word the words Cold War, but since others have used that, the idea of a new Cold War, but that others have used that idea, and the recent Australia, UK, US agreement, the arising of the importance of the Quad, US military deployments in the region suggest that this is an active insurance policy, not a passive one. So I'm curious if the US and China do move more in the direction of a deeply competitive relationship with security implications for all, does this not fracture an ASEAN that's with its great differences in viewpoint about the two countries? Doesn't this pose a real threat to not just to global peace, but to ASEAN itself? Amitav, let me ask you if you could speak to this.
Thank you. Immediate answer to what you said, the last part, is that there is not much ASEAN can do to influence Chinese-US policy, especially the dyadic policy between the US and China. There's not much ASEAN can do, really. But ASEAN can shield itself, make itself less vulnerable to that competition. And that has been traditionally ASEAN's approach. There's not much ASEAN can do about US-Soviet rivalry during the Cold War, but it created this idea of a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality to shield itself by developing norms, like how much one should take sides, the question of military bases being kind of it was fine-tuned, but being temporary. So ASEAN can actually make itself less vulnerable to the rivalry rather than influencing the rivalry, because that's beyond ASEAN's pay grade, so to speak. And I think it is also possible that the US-China, again, I try to be counterintuitive on this. Everybody's saying US-China is going to escalate. I actually see scenarios when they will de-escalate. And because there are limits to competition. I think my friend Tom Christensen has written an article in Foreign Affairs about this, which is pretty much also what I agree, that there are limits to how far US and China can put the world on the brink, because they themselves have a lot to lose. Then this is not the Cold War again, because the economic linkages between the US and China and the region are much more different than the economic linkages between the US and the Soviet Union. I'd like to very quickly also respond to Kavi, if you don't mind. I prefer co-engagement to peaceful coexistence. Coexistence is a very passive policy. It's existential. We exist with each other. Engagement is a more active policy. We engage with each other. We don't just exist, we engage. So I prefer that term than to, coexistence. And coexistence, as you know, has a really negative baggage. The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence has a bad legacy in Southeast Asia, but also in generally Asia. Finally, one more point about Australia, UK, US. I haven't figured out how to pronounce it without stammering. Now, to me, it's also, again, we are making too much out of it. There are always different levels and layers of relationship among American allies. Not all allies are the same. The real impact, the real reason why the French are angry, and they have every right to be, is the economic. They're going to lose like $50 billion or $100 billion, and any country would be angry about it. But strategically, does it really matter that much? I don't think so, because there are ways in which United States can compensate France by developing different types of relationship, and so in any alliance relationship, some allies are more equal than others. I am not really surprised. That I don't see this as a epoch changing or a world order changing development, the way Economist magazine puts it in a recent editorial in it. But the United States should really try to mollify France economically and strategically, and there are a lot of things the US can do. And if it doesn't do that, that's a failure of US policy.
Thank you. Those are all excellent points. And Alice, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned the importance of emphasizing connectivity among ASEAN countries. I am curious, though, because my question to Amitav really was about internal cohesion in ASEAN in a circumstance where US-China competition increases, and as much as ASEAN members may say they do not want to choose sides as an organization, the individual members are in fact making choices every day. So I wondered if what you thought about the idea of cohesiveness under the pressures that might come from a more intense competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very good question. And I do think that is, as I suggested in my remarks, I think for geopolitical and domestic reasons, we do see some of those fault lines, plague ASEAN on various issues. We can cite several. But, and I do think that is an ongoing concern. I think in terms of what, and I think this is also why the situation in Myanmar is also, of course, quite challenging for the ASEAN states. I know Kavi has covered this at great length, but it's taken a long time, right, in terms of ASEAN being able to get all the different states on board, including, of course, Myanmar itself. And so I think that, this gets back to one of my ending points, which is that, maintaining those relations becomes the most important. And maybe this also relates to Amitav's point, and it was a question that I might have pressed him on a little bit, is, in what areas should ASEAN, in fact, scale back, right, in order to kind of refocus on, I think, what is more critical, which is those intra-ASEAN relations as kind of the starting point for everything else.
Holly, what about inter-ASEAN relations or intra-ASEAN relations, I should say, in the circumstance of challenging geopolitical questions?
You're asking me?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, indeed. Alice has made some a point here about inter-ASEAN relationships under pressure from internal circumstances like the Myanmar problem, as well as external influences such as the US-China competition. I wondered your thoughts about how cohesive the organization really is.
Well, thank you for asking me that. It depends on the issue. As you can observe from the issue of Myanmar, I see a very good opportunity for United States and China to work together. As you can see, last week, both of them did not challenge the credential of the NLD because they want to make sure that ASEAN retains the centrality and the key mechanism to find long-lasting settlement. That is why it takes so long. And Alice pointed out that it's very difficult to get all 10 countries. As you know, ASEAN is like a Disneyland of world politics. We have all the political system into one. So to get all of them together and make one decision is not good. But when ASEAN make decision, they cannot retract. And we are not superpower. We say one thing, we follow through. That is one of the important. And also when ASEAN dealing with major power, there are different tracks, bilateral track and collective track. And also there is all sorts of ASEAN-led mechanism that allow major power to meet and whatever to exchange view. And I think that's what ASEAN is good for. It's allowed major power to take a pause from whatever they have and come to the region and see, what actual situation, and I think it's good. That is why ASEAN will continue to play the role of convening power and allows whatever the qualities of the 10 country common decision that I think ASEAN dialogue partner will support, particularly in Myanmar.
Thank you, and thank you all three for your comments. We now have about a half hour remaining for questions and answers, and we have almost 20 questions in our queue. So I'm going to ask Courtney, as she always does so well, to integrate, synthesize, and see if we can join some questions together and pose them for our panelists.
Indeed, and I do know we still have questions coming in, so I will endeavor to sort of coordinate between those as we continue to get questions entering the queue. I'm going to try and start with some of the bigger picture questions that we have, and then narrow down as we continue the conversation towards some of the very specific and targeted questions. So I think probably unsurprisingly, given the recentness of the announcement, we have a lot of questions that are related to AUKUS. So I'm going to try and combine a couple of these. But we had one question from American University. We had one question from the CICEALS team, a recent graduate, talking about sort of the implications of AUKUS for Southeast Asia, noting that there's sort of official opinion appears to be divided between countries, with some indicating opposition to the pact and some countries indicating greater support. There hasn't been much comment from Thailand yet. So question for Khun Kavi, can you talk about what the United States and Australia can do to reassure Southeast Asia that AUKUS will not destabilize the region? And then adding in a couple comments and questions from others, what are sort of the perceptions that our panelists have about the state of interest in AUKUS from different states in ASEAN?
Well, thank you very much. I think one thing that Thailand does not understand, that why United States have this idea, the game that ASEAN member cannot play. As you can see, only Australia can play in this nuclear submarine, but not the other country. And of course, the role of Australia in building peace and stability in ASEAN is well known, since the Cambodian conflicts. And Cambodia and Australia now try to upgrade its strategic relation to a more, what you call, comprehensive strategic partnership later this year. So we'll see. But I think this latest alliance with United States and UK would delay. I think some country in ASEAN are not very happy with the Australian decision, especially Malaysia and Indonesia, because it intensifies the tension between rivalry, US and China, as well as instigate armed races.
Do you want me to respond to that also? I want to look at it from an Australian perspective. I actually spent a lot of my youth in Australia. And my first foray into strategic studies were at Australian National University. I'm a PhD from Australia. You want to know why the Australians are doing it? They're not doing it for ASEAN. They're doing it for themselves. They have been in the receiving end of Chinese, very serious, explicit Chinese anger, to put it mildly, or even threat. And they needed to do something about it. Second, there's nothing new about this. Now, United States and Britain have always been closer in terms of strategy in Asia Pacific. Of course, France and US have been very closer when it comes to American independence and all that. But US and UK have always been closer strategically. It's a special relationship. And Australia kind of has always been. Some of the most important military bases of the United States are in Australia, Pine Gap, Noongar. And so I don't get really dumbfounded by this. But I do think that the United States has a messaging problem. They have not messaged it very well to France and not also to ASEAN. And I think China, of course, predictably angry, and one can understand that, but they also have partly themselves to blame for it, because the amount of pressure Australia has faced from China is extraordinary. I'm not saying that lightly. I've followed this. But other than that, I agree that ASEAN never speaks in the same voice on these things, by the way. There's always differences in ASEAN, going back to the Vietnam War.
I would agree with that. If I guess I'm next. I would agree with that. That I think differences in terms of what is the appropriate great power or large power security roles is a problem since the founding of ASEAN. And so that's not new. I would also just echo on the AUKUS question, something that Amitav had said in his starting remarks, which is that there's lots of questions about it, right? And so this was just announced. I think some of the details and how it's going to be implemented are still open questions. There are questions about Australia's capability to support it, right? I think that AUKUS right now, the primary significance is that it's signaling, right? The United States and Australia are signaling, and they're signaling to China about their concerns and the seriousness of their concerns. So that's what AUKUS is at the current moment. How it will evolve from here, I think, is something that we will have to kind of watch and see.
And to sort of continue on the AUKUS and security thread for a moment, we had another question sort of specifically looking at sort of the nuclear aspect of this, talking about concerns over nuclear race in the region. So, a question to any of the panelists who want to answer is sort of the extent to which the AUKUS movement on nuclear issues is an opportunity for China in its competition for influence, given that Beijing has previously stated its support for a Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone treaty.
Well, can I answer on this point? ASEAN now has adopted a very ambiguous position. Earlier, ASEAN welcomed China's willingness to accede to Chon Phase, but now ASEAN would like all the big power five to accede to Chon Phase treaty at the same time. But now with all these AUKUS, I think it's also complicated because ASEAN does not want to see a much more competition in nuclear, the use of nuclear power. Of course, we prefer nuclear power used for peaceful purposes. So as you can see now, almost since 1995, the ASEAN has ratified Chon Phase. There's no major power signed into it.
All right, well then moving on from that security angle, I'll ask another question, and I think that this one perhaps Amitav may have specifically some thoughts on, but moving beyond the security angle, what would a successful US trade and economic policy look like in Southeast Asia? And I will throw in sort of the question, given China's recent signaling on its interest in joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership with the US, which the US is not currently moving towards and has likely not a clear indication of moving towards, what do you see a potential US economic policy looking like as an alternative?
Okay, in my limited knowledge of economics, but kind of geoeconomics maybe the way I would put it, this is my personal view, but a preference, the United States should, Biden administration should try to differentiate itself from the Trump administration. And to try to find a way out of this so-called trade war, because it is not something Southeast Asian countries really feel comfortable with. The effect of this policy, a trade war, is too early to judge. Whether it has really hurt China is a matter of a debate. It might have hurt China in some ways, but in some way, China actually has continued to grow and done well. But I think the United States should develop its own, Biden should develop its own economic policy and not simply keep following what Trump did. And that could mean, there is not much interest in free trade agreements in the current US administration or in the US general public. I guess that is something the Biden administration probably have to pay attention to. Maybe this administration doesn't care about economics as much as strategy. I mean, all the major policy developments that has happened since Biden took office are in the strategic domain, Indo-Pacific and the like. But I think the United States vaccine initiative is a good one. The day Biden was elected, I wrote an op-ed for PacNet a couple of days later, and I said the Quad should go into the business of vaccine manufacturing and distributing. And I think that's a very good strategy. And try to help Southeast Asia recover from the pandemic is far more important than creating a free trade arrangement or reviving its own the TPP or the child of TPP, and then at the same time try to sort of somehow ease the U.S.-China trade relations, because that will be good for stability. But I may be a minority here in the Washington policy establishment.
Can I just quickly add to that? I mean, I think, you know, as Amitav has suggested and as others have observed, I think the question mark in terms of Biden's Southeast Asia policy is the economics, right? I mean, it's been very kind of, you know, conventional strategic forward. And so this is, and economics matters so much, right, in terms of the region. And arguably, this is also one of the primary paths by which ASEAN states have pursued their own security, right? It's through economics. I think that unfortunately, I think I guess the question mark over economics over Biden policy does feed this narrative that it is military first. I think that from an ideal standpoint, I would argue that, you know, an inclusive regional integration framework, whether it's RCEP, CPTPP, you know, that those would be ideal, but under the current domestic circumstances, that's going to be more of a challenge. And of course, the fact that Trump pulled out of TPP doesn't give people much reassurance either in terms of these mechanisms. And so I think to Amitav's point, in terms of what are kind of the immediate things that the United States can do, is to kind of do those kind of lower hanging fruit, so to speak, right? Which is to, whether it's vaccine diplomacy, whether it's also investments or facilitating investments, whether it's infrastructure or private investment. I think those are the ways in which the United States can still, you know, play that economic game.
Thank you both. So I'm going to jump in and pick up on a comment that Kavi made earlier to sort of talk briefly about the Mekong within the context of ASEAN. So I think, as we all know, ASEAN is useful at organizing multilateral discourse and outcomes on some issues, but not all relevant issues. And one of our attendees mentioned that the Mekong is a case in point. Without signaling from ASEAN or elevation of the Mekong issue to multilateral discourse levels, the US and China are sort of taking the lead on this through as an external partners. And that's you know, potentially more controversial and unproductive. Within the same context, climate change is arguably the most pressing issue that ASEAN will face in the medium to long term. And, you know, the question is this going to fall into the same category as the Mekong, where, say, the United States, China, and other external partners apply separate approaches to an issue that's vital to the region that would ultimately be painted as a zero-sum approach?
Wow, it's very interesting. I think ASEAN has a common approach to climate change. I think ASEAN has been in close discussion with EU. The fact that in the past few years, they have close discussion, they even have a joint statement. But on the issue that you are highly interested is Mekong. Of course, Mekong now is a very highly contested regions between the United States, China. I think America now has paid more attention. It had come out with a very strong plan under the Mekong US partnership recently at the ASEAN meeting with United States. I think that's a good one. But to really do the job, America has to push forward and make sure that you have a high level meeting at the summit level. It was unfortunate that Trump canceled that meeting last March in Las Vegas. Otherwise, it would provide the much needed impetus for America to revitalize the engagement with Mekong. At the moment, China through Lanchang Mekong has done a much better job because over the past 5 years, over 500 projects has been carried out, almost cost China $300 million. Now, within ASEAN, Vietnam and some other riparian country wants to raise this issue within ASEAN, but at the moment, I think ASEAN is split. Even though as early as 1992, there is a project within ASEAN to take care of Mekong, but now I think Mekong is restricted to the lower riparian country, and at the moment, the attention is focused on that, leading by Thailand and Vietnam. And as you know, within ASEAN, you have this sub-regional group known as ACMEX, which you also currently you're also interested in. So I think in the future, ASEAN will, like South China Sea, will incorporate Mekong, but at the moment, I don't think it's the time.
I don't have anything to add. I completely agree with Kavi on this, and he should know better because he's closer to Mekong than I am. I'm closer to Potomac. So, but I wanted to, if you can give me some time, either now or later, to address a question that Prashant Parmesaran raised about Indo-Pacific, and also in that context, a question from India from Van Singh. I saw it in the chat, but I can do that later. But I just need a couple of minutes to address their question about Indo-Pacific and what sort of a strategic construction it is and how it might evolve. But it's up to you.
Let's go ahead and do that now.
Yeah,
Okay.
so you preempted me. So I'm just going to read Prashant's question for those who don't have access to the chat and are watching via the live stream. So previously, Amitav had mentioned that Indo-Pacific at this stage can be said to be a concept framed more by strategists relative to existing terms like Asia-Pacific that initially was perceived to be more economic. So Amitav, do you see this changing over time or remaining this way in the coming years? And what are the prospects for this being accepted more broadly? And to what extent does ASEAN have the ability to shape this into a more comprehensive regional construct beyond what it's already done through moves such as AOIP in order to avoid erosion of ASEAN centrality or autonomy?
So just a quick background. This is a point I made actually in a virtual meeting to Bangkok, the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific conference, and Kavi was part of that as well, where I said pretty much that the Far East was created by imperialists, like Britain called it Far East. Asia was created by nationalists, like Jawaharlal Nehru and others. Asia Pacific by economists, including Australian, Japanese, and US economists, and people like Hariso Sastro from Indonesia. East Asia was by culturalists, like Mahathir Mohamad talking about East Asia without Caucasians. And Indo-Pacific to me seems like a very strategic construct. It was actually coined by people like Rory Metcalf, for example, from Australia, a strategist, or an Indian strategist. I think the person who coined might have been an Indian Army or military official, Navy official. So this actually, in a nutshell, sums up the changing dynamics of the region. And this goes back to the point about Indo-Pacific being a very strategic construct. And it has two dimensions. One is that not only it is strategic, but it also seems to be the momentum is with outside powers. Who are the members of Quad, outside relation to ASEAN? It's Japan, Australia, United States, India, and none of them are Southeast Asian countries. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, they're outside. People would challenge me on that, whether India is outside. It is outside of Southeast Asia. So it's not been part of ASEAN. So that creates some sort of a discomfort in ASEAN, which is always concerned about its autonomy and identity. This is one reason why Indonesia, which already Martin Atlagawa had already coined, developed this idea, his own idea of Indo-Pacific. And then Indonesian government, Jokowi government, they take the lead in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. How it might evolve. I was very skeptical on Indo-Pacific when it came, because I don't like concepts like regions change, keep changing names just because something happens. But I have come to accept, based on research, that there is a historical logic behind Indo-Pacific that can be actually quite beneficial to the region. And this will be the subject of my next book, which is called Return of Geopolitics. Can Asia cope with the return of geopolitics? Now, put it very bluntly, Indo-Pacific refers back to the Indian Ocean trading network, historically. The largest, most open trading network in the world until the Europeans came in and disrupted it. It was also Indo-Pacific is where the idea of freedom of seas was invented, not in the Mediterranean, which was a closed sea. The Romans called the Mediterranean our sea, Mare Nostrum. The Indo-Pacific was always a mare liberum, open, and anybody couldn't trade. There is a long history of literature in Indo-Pacific. More importantly, in Indian Ocean. China was part of it, but not hegemonic. Very different from the tributary system in East Asia. So when people talk about return of history, tributary system, you revive Chinese hegemony. Indian Ocean had no hegemony of any country. China was a player, so was India, so was Southeast Asia. but it was open and interactive. So I think if you can give it a cultural dimension, a historical dimension, you could move the discourse away from the strategic dimension and actually give Southeast Asians agency, because Southeast Asia was at the heart of the Indian Ocean trading network. And I actually think that sort of a framing could be better, but I will do this as an academic, but how much, I actually did give a lecture to the US Indo-Pacific Command a couple of months ago, talking to them about this, but I don't know how much of this will go in. But I think this should change, and this will actually be a good thing, a non-hegemonic, open historical construction that could actually guide the future. And the United States should benefit from it, because the United States champions freedom of the seas. And freedom of the seas was, you can find this in Malacca, you can find this in the old Indian Ocean. There is considerable historical evidence of Indian Ocean trade from Africa to Eastern Indonesia and going all the way to Northeast Asia, which was open, non-hegemonic, non-coercive.
If I can just add two things to that, I'll just echo the point that Amitav just made, which is that, with any strategic concept, it's the content that matters, right? And so it's what does it mean, and how is it being interpreted? I think the second point that I would just make is that the big question mark about the Indo-Pacific is India, right? I mean, if we're going to think both in terms of strategic dimensions as well as the economic dimensions, I think RCEP is a case in point.
All right, well, I'm going to just go ahead and pick up on that. So we've had a few questions in the chat about sort of how the panelists perceive both India and Japan's roles in the region. So, I think, Alice, you just sort of touched on that. Amitav, you touched on sort of perceptions of them as outside players, but, within the context that you just shared, do you see as a sort of forward-looking, constructive role for Japan and India? And what do you think that would look like different from what it is today?
I would defer to Alice and Kavi on this. I have my own views, but maybe
I think I'll defer to
start with Alice. Yeah.
Okay. I think both Japan and India have an important role to play, and the two of them as democracy, they try to hook up together for quite some time. They were unable to do so because Japan is very close to United States. And in fact, whatever Japan do, ASEAN has the kind of idea that America is always behind. Unlike India, India is totally independent in its formation policy toward ASEAN. In fact, India have to be given credit because it's the first country to accede to Treaty of Amity at the same time in 2003, together with China, as you can see. Both of them have close relation with ASEAN, but China managed to go much deeper. And now India actually try to associate with India, with ASEAN much closer through Indo-Pacific. Actually, India has the whole concept of Indo-Pacific based on ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, and I think that is positive. But the inability of India to join the RCEP is a big drawback for Indian roles, and it's not only impact on ASEAN, but it impact on other countries that relied on India. For example, South Korea New Southern policy, half of its policy depend on the economic integration of India with the region. And now without that kind of RCEP participation, it has to renew its whole approach. So the role of India is very important in the future, but India has yet to come out of its cocoon and really fully engage, And I always said to my friends, you have look east, act east policy, but Indian attitude toward the whole thing is at ease. So I have to do more action.
I completely agree with that, and I also want to add that India's engagement in Southeast Asia is a matter of a lot of expectations and very little fulfillment. India continues to disappoint Southeast Asian nations, including some of its biggest champions like Singapore, which almost single-handedly brought India into East Asian Summit, for example. But that could be a issue of Indian domestic politics. I think Indian leaders do recognize the importance of ASEAN, but their hands are tied by domestic politics, just like Americans and other countries. So India needs to really find a way to develop a more meaningful economic engagement with Southeast Asia that doesn't continue to disappoint its ASEAN partners. And I kind of reinforce what Kavi said, and that based on my decades in Southeast Asia, that's the perception I got from everywhere.
Okay, well, I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and ask what I think will be the final question before turning things over to Bill for closing us out. And this one is sort of a fairly specific question looking at the near future. As we all know, Cambodia will be chairing the 2022 ASEAN Summit. So the question is sort of, given Cambodia's intimate ties to China that have previously taken priority, as we saw with sort of the 2016 South China Sea challenges, what do you all expect to see under Cambodia's chairmanship for next year? And I'll sort of throw in with, within the context that we're seeing of continuing COVID pandemic, the challenges with Myanmar and many of the other urgent issues facing ASEAN right now. How do you see that balancing out against these longer term challenges like South China Sea, climate change, and some of the other topics that we've all discussed? So I'll turn that over, and hopefully we can get some thoughts from each of you on that, and then Bill will close this out.
Why don't I start first? It will be very exciting years for Cambodia. Remember, Hun Sen is very perceptive, and he's very Machiavellian when it comes to lead ASEAN. He's the most important ASEAN leader who really take ASEAN in a different direction. Next year, I expect Cambodian chair to be very active, because during the meetings on Myanmar in April, it was Hun Sen that really woke up all the ASEAN leaders, encouraged Min Aung Hlaing, said that you better listen to ASEAN and let ASEAN help you. Look at me, Cambodia had the same experience. ASEAN helped to rehabilitate and settle some of the problem. So next year, you will see ASEAN engage with major power differently. I think there's one idea that is now working on is ASEAN +2, so that ASEAN can have a meeting between China and also United States. The role that ASEAN would like to play, so that they can turn their competition into cooperation. And I think on the other issue, whether it's on the COVID economic recovery, on climate change, I think Cambodia and EU have been negotiating on this issue. So for me personally, I see a more active, engaging Cambodian chair. Of course, people will worry about 2012, saying that, same thing might happen. I can guarantee it would not happen under next year. That's my take.
Well, if you want me to add to that, last time Cambodia was ASEAN chair, and compared it to today, Cambodia has become much more dependent economically and politically on China. Even then in 2012, I believe, in the last it was chair, it was dependent, but the dependence has grown, mainly because of the Belt and Road Initiative projects in Cambodia. Second, the last time Cambodia was chair of ASEAN, that's the first time ASEAN could not issue a joint communique after its meeting, ASEAN foreign ministers. So those are kind of things that create some concern in my mind of how this will happen. But I do agree that Cambodia is also an independent country, very independent-minded country. Hun Sen is a little more confident, while he has kind of a very stronghold in power. He may want to play the role of ASEAN statesman, and therefore try to find a way to bring some sort of unity and consensus. I do agree that he could well be a very active chair. Given the circumstances, it's not going to be easy, but he will be. But I also, at the moment, I think one has to keep in mind that Cambodia's dependence on China is much greater today. And in the past, Cambodia has been willing to walk away from ASEAN. In fact, not just once, twice. In 1997, when Hun Sen basically launched a coup against Hun Sen Pech and Ranariddh, and basically walked away, because that's why ASEAN said membership will be postponed by 2 years. ASEAN 10 was delayed by 2 years. So Hun Sen in the past has been. I met him actually. I have a gift from him as well as from the late King Prince Sihanouk. My sense is that Cambodia is fiercely independent. It doesn't want to be a vassal of any country, but at the same time very practical and much closer to China. And it will be very careful about antagonizing China in any sort of a way during its year as the chair.
I'll just emphasize some of those same points. I mean, I think that, no doubt the Cambodia relationship with China is very important and has become more important in some important ways. But I think that we also have to keep in mind that I think Cambodia is also concerned about itself, right? And I think that also, that last stint as chair is something that will hang over its chairmanship for next year. I think Cambodia is aware of that. I think the other ASEAN states are also aware of that. And so, yes, I mean, I think that, next year will be different as, every chair of ASEAN has their own kind of style and priorities. I think we can see distinctive things coming out from different chairs. Cambodia will be no different, but I do think that national reputation will also matter to some extent for Cambodia, given what happened last time.
Just quickly, this is what King Sihanouk gave me. It's on my desk. I think, Kavi, you were with me when we went with Raja to meet him in the palace. You must have said, I still keep it. And one thing Sihanouk told me, that Cambodia will never be a vassal of any country. Or there is China. And actually, he did say that which country threatens him most? He said China. I said, how come? Because you go for treatment to China every year. He said, because China is too close to us. So Southeast Asian situation is much more complex. I mean, they try to balance different calculations, cultural ties, the economic dependence, but also desire for independence and autonomy. These are, after all, fairly newly independent countries that are buffeted by big powers like China and India and the United States now. So I think that desire for autonomy is very, very important for Hun Sen as for anybody else in the region. Okay.
Well, thank you all very much. Unlike some questions which we have to wait considerable time to find answers to, the question of Cambodia's role in ASEAN as leader of ASEAN, I think will be answered almost immediately. So let us see. And we'll be here to discuss that role at the Southeast Asia Forum later in this semester. Well, we unfortunately have reached the end of our time. We have, as always is the case, more questions than time to answer them. So our apologies to those who did not have their questions answered, but we're always here to forward questions to speakers if you would like to pursue the question that you've raised. But let me take this moment to thank our very excellent panel. This has been a terrific discussion. Amitav Acharya, Alice Ba, Kavi Chongkitavorn, thank you so much for your insights and your analysis. We are in your debt. Please buy Amitav's book. It is excellent and will expand on your knowledge and understanding of a very important topic. Second, thank you to our audience for joining us today and for posing such provocative, such thought-provoking questions, and to Courtney, of course, for managing the Q&A. And finally, please do check out our web pages at the Stimson Center website. There's a great deal there. If you think your college or university or your organization, especially student organization, should be interested in partnering with the Southeast Asia Forum, please do contact us. Until the next time, stay safe, get your shots, and be well. Thank you all. Good afternoon.
Thank you.